My name's Liz Weaver, and I'm a Vice President with Tamarack. We're really pleased that all of you could join us on the call today, and we're especially pleased that John Kania has taken some time off out of his very busy life to join us. The topic of today's webinar is collective impact backbones, what we are learning. And this is actually, this webinar, the idea behind this webinar came forward because of the two Champions for Change workshops that Tamarack and FSG Social Impact Consultants are hosting, first in Washington at the end of the month, and then in Calgary, Alberta in April. So that's the whole idea behind the webinar. Of the speakers, I wanted to introduce our webinar speakers. So first I want to introduce John. So John is a board member and managing director at FSG and has been in that role for the past 14 years. John focuses on inspiring FSG's leadership team, consultants, and operations staff to achieve excellence in their work. And I would have to say, John, that you also inspire us at Tamarack on the same mission. So maybe you can add that into your bio moving forward. John has led dozens of strategic planning and evaluation efforts for foundations, nonprofits, and corporations. Client activity includes significant experience in education, economic and community development, healthcare, and the environment. He has been a leader in FSG's intellectual capital development related to catalytic philanthropy, collective impact, shared value, and community foundation sustainability. We're very happy, John, that you can join us.
Thanks, Liz. It's always a pleasure to be with you and your colleagues at Tamarack, and great to be with all of the other 150 or so I think we have on the phone, or something like that, kindred spirits who are with us today. Hello, everyone.
So I just want to, John, before we dive into the interview that we have and the questions that we've identified, I just wanted to give everybody an overview of today's webinar topic. So we're going to spend a bit of time at the very beginning just talking about FSG and, you know, your role in both uncovering the collective impact framework, but also how you've been seeing it evolve. We're going to talk about trends around the adoption of collective impact, really focus a bit of our time on the core role of backbones in collective impact, talk a little bit about, you know, Canadian and U.S. backbone trends, and then lead into what people might learn at the Champions for Change workshop that is happening next week in D.C., Washington, D.C., and then in April in Calgary. I think, you know, one of the things that I recognize, John, that, you know, collective impact and particularly the role of backbones and backbone infrastructure is a really important topic in collective impact as we move forward. So I want to begin with our first question. So tell us a little bit about the work of FSG and when your interest in collective impact really began. So maybe take us back to, you know, 2011.
Sure, great. Well, maybe even a little bit earlier there, but I promise to be succinct.
Okay.
So for those folks who don't know FSG well, we're a group of about 150 people at this point doing work all over the world around. And we're a mission-driven consulting firm. We support leaders in achieving large-scale, lasting social change, and you know, we work on all issues in, you know, social and environmental issues. Our work is principally in the areas of strategy and evaluation, and we work with clients both individually and increasingly collectively, as evidenced, you know, in our collective impact work. And we also contribute to the field through research, writing, and supporting learning communities and accelerating social progress. Probably most relevant among our learning communities for this conversation is the Collective Impact Forum, which you can get to at collectiveimpactforum.org. It's a public good initiative that's in partnership with the Aspen Institute, Tamarack, and a number of other organizations around collective impact and what we can all learn. And yeah, so in terms of you know, where and how did we get to this? Well, our work in collective impact initially was prompted by work we did back in about 2009 around the issue of shared measurement, which I know many of you on the phone are familiar with. How do we align, how organizations who are working on the same issue, whether it's in education, health, the environment, how do we begin to align the ways that we define success and that we're going to measure success, so that organizations working on the same issue can measure success in the same way. And in 2009, we went out and we researched that, in 2009, we published a white paper called Breakthroughs in Shared Measurement. And, we're sort of blown away by the amazing resonance that had in the field, just, the amount of sort of feedback we got and just the amount of attention to this issue of shared measurement. And that led us further, along with other, just observations we were making on the social sector and what was really going to lead to progress. We among all, many had concluded that it can't be just one organization at a time. But, really with the shared measurement and the resonance of that, that led us to further investigation of what it takes to achieve collective change on, issues at scale. And so shared measurement in and of itself isn't enough to achieve collective progress at scale. It's just one component. So we looked at where initiatives, and principally looking at, initiatives that were collective and collaborative and cross-sector, because we had a hypothesis that we really needed to involve multiple sectors, all sectors, in addressing, issues of systemic change. And so we looked at, initiatives that were achieving progress at scale, and that led to the framing around collective impact, and the 5 conditions for change, or the 5 conditions for collective impact that we talk about. So yeah, that's pretty much the genesis of what got us to, in 2011, publishing that research in an article that appeared in Stanford Social Innovation Review called Collective Impact. And the rest, as we say, is the history. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think, thanks for that, John. I think it is really important to, see how collective impact started from one place, right? It started from this notion of shared measurement, and I think that that's been a really critical element of one of the conditions of collective impact, but also a critical element, in terms of the work going forward. So our second question that we have is that, we both have seen a large number of backbones emerge in Canada, the U.S., and internationally. Are there some patterns that you're seeing as communities adopt collective impact?
Yeah, so, I think just maybe to follow on from the 2011 publication and then to sort of get into patterns, I think, what's interesting is we would never suggest, and I hope nobody would ever assume that we think we invented collective impact, if you will. Comprehensive community change has been around for, decades upon decades, and hopefully the framing around collective impact gave some common and, simple and resonant language, and, a sort of a structure to how, we all can think about disciplined, structured, collaborative work, and that the name collective impact in and of itself and the framing of the 5 conditions, were useful to many people in terms of doing work that they were already doing, and thinking about how to do that work better. And I think in particular, it's been interesting to hear sort of, what resonated with people. And, certainly shared measurement did. That was something that wasn't being talked about a lot, or people thought it was the holy grail and it could never be done. But the other, thing that I think many people felt was distinctive from work that had gone before on, thinking about comprehensive community change or collective impact efforts, et cetera, was this notion in spotlighting the role of a backbone organization. And, in many respects, I think, what the framework of the 5 conditions, including, the identification of the need for a backbone, it sort of legitimized, the absolute need for the existence of a set of resources that we call backbone, whose sole purpose is the alignment and coordination of the sole purpose of the backbone is the alignment and coordination of, everybody else. And, And there were backbones that existed before we came up with a name. But it gave sort of it gave a metaphor. How can how can the body do anything without a backbone? And that I think really super resonated for people. And it's all to the good. And I think folks have said that it's great that we're highlighting and spotlighting the need for that. And I would say that in our research and our observation is that probably the #1 reason that collaboratives, coalitions fail, and many do, if the measure is positive and consistent progress at scale. That the reason that many collaboratives and coalitions fail is because they fail to put sufficient investment and recognition into the need for a backbone organization. So what's interesting, since if you sort of think about patterns in the evolutions of backbones, since at least the initial article was published, which at this point is 3.5 years or so, one was the initial rush to be the backbone, or to declare that one's organization was the backbone. It's sort of like before that, nobody wanted to be infrastructure because, who likes infrastructure? But I mean, this is another word for the infrastructure you need for a coalition, and the backbone made it sexy, and made the role sexy. And so all of a sudden, everybody wanted to be the backbone. And we'll talk a little bit more about misconceptions about what the backbone is, but it's a little bit of, who died and made you the backbone. The community has to sort of anoint, the community has to come to a conclusion of who they feel is best situated to play that role. And it's an interesting dance there, and we can talk more about that if people want. But I think that would be one of the patterns, is that once the term was out there and given some legitimacy, all of a sudden everybody wanted to do it, or felt they were already doing it. And in many respects, both are true, that there are many organizations out there who play some of the different roles of being a backbone. So that would be one pattern, was, wow, all of a sudden, lots and lots of people declaring that they're the backbone. I think what's also interesting, and this is sort of, the counter trend to that, all of a sudden, the role was given some legitimacy, and organizations who were doing that had a way of talking about what they were doing. I think that's the real positive thing. Yeah, there were some who were sort of claiming falsely that they were the backbone, but there were many that were playing that role, and now had a way to talk about it that was more compelling, and they could talk to funders and say, listen, this is the role that we're playing. But what's interesting is that despite the new emphasis, the new recognition, of this backbone role, I would say a key pattern is that there's still hugely underinvestment by private funders and government in the role of the backbone. And I always say, if you're a funder, and funders always talk about leverage in their, grant making, that, goodness, this is about the most leverage investment that you could make in a backbone, because what you're talking about is an organization who's not, necessarily direct service or an advocacy organization or part of government. And in some instances, it may be an organization that's doing those other things, but when they're playing the backbone role, it's what they're doing is they're helping to align and coordinate, budgets, the organizations with budgets that are in the billions of dollars in many instances, in many communities. And the investment to, do the backbone set of activities is in the $1 to $2 to $3 million. And so we're talking, a rounding error that's not, even on the face of several $billion. And so it's the most leveraged investment I think a funder could make. But the reality is it's still heavily underinvested in. And for those that are on the phone playing that role, I'd be, real surprised if you don't agree with that. So, I think I think we've made some progress in identifying the value and demonstrating the value of backbone plays. And even we've made some progress in evaluating and helping organizations that are backbones, and funders that are investing in backbones, determine how you can evaluate the success of a backbone. But we're still in a mode where, in most instances, in many instances, there's likely a continued need for visionary funding, certainly at the outset of an initiative, in the backbone set of resources. You need to have, it could be a private funder, in some instances it may be government, that you've got individuals that are saying, okay, we are banking on the fact that, putting this set of resources in place and funding it will achieve, the ends that we're looking at. So I think that would be the second pattern. There's been a rush to the backbone on the one hand. On the other hand, despite sort of the new spotlight and emphasis, there's still, an underinvestment. I would say the third pattern is, and we're going to talk, I hope we'll talk a little bit more about this in the call, is I think there's been more of a spotlight on the role, and as there's more communication between communities and within communities for those that are in the role and those that are funding the role and those that are, partnering with the role of the backbone, that there's a real sort of recognition and increasing emphasis on what type of leadership is needed in a backbone organization. It is very different than running an organization. It is, as many on the phone know, the structure and the way that collective impact initiatives are put together. If they're going to truly be successful in the goal of achieving progress at scale, it's a non-hierarchical structure. And there are a lot of different sort of good, we've put out some thinking about this. Others have also put out some great thinking about the fact that this is not a hierarchical structure. It is not command and control. There is nobody in control. And so there's an increasing recognition that it's a very unique form of leadership in the backbone organization. We've written about it most recently, in an article that sort of encompasses, a broader look at what's needed to create change and, collective change, an article that some may be familiar with that we published in the most recent Stanford Social Innovation Review called The Dawn of System Leadership. And so that's an article by Peter Senge, great systems thinker, and Hal Hamilton, and myself, which really tries to shine a spotlight on what type of leadership is needed to create collaborative collective change. And we call it system leadership. And that is, in my mind, the type of leadership that's needed to, help a backbone be successful. So those would be three patterns that I would point to. There are probably many others that we can talk about.
I think, John, that gives us a really good overview in terms of, the thinking behind backbones as a whole, but also the patterns. I think I would agree with you on the patterns that you've identified in terms of, the idea of legitimizing the backbone, still a little bit of we need to consider and to make the right case for investment in backbones and the leverage effect of that, and the whole idea of system and leadership. So those are, I think, really great patterns for the folks on the call to think about. Now, you mentioned a little bit in your answer about the core roles of backbones, and I know that FSG has worked with the Greater Cincinnati Foundation around these core roles. I wonder if you could, go through them really quickly and then answer whether you think that there, in your opinion, that there have been some shifts or have some of the roles moved up to higher priority or not.
Yeah. So yeah, on the slide that's up right now is the 6 core functions that we've identified in our work, principally working and initially with the Greater Cincinnati Foundation and a number of sophisticated backbones in their community, but also validated elsewhere. These 6 core functions that you see here, and we've published extensively and deeply and thoroughly on this. And so I'm not going to go into the roles themselves. I think as you look at them on the slide, guiding vision and strategy, supporting aligned activities, establishing shared measurement practices, building public will, advancing policy, mobilizing funding. I think they're pretty self-explanatory, although we've written extensively on this, and you can go to collectiveimpactforum.org or FSG site and read at a deeper level. What I'll try to do is address this question of, we developed this perspective a couple of years ago, and I think one of the questions, that we get that Liz just raised is, has it changed? What are you seeing? What's your updated perspective on this? And I would say that, we haven't seen, we think these 6 roles continue to be, probably the major ones that, need to be attended to for backbone organizations. I think where at least our perspective is evolving is on the how these roles are done, who does these roles, and how many, if you will. And so actually there are a couple other slides in here. Kirsty, if you might switch to the next slide. Thank you. So this is a slide we've shared in a lot of different venues, and we'll share it next week at the Backbone workshop. So, when we initially defined this role of the backbone organization, we never envisioned the backbone role as one that, was running the show. That was not how we ever defined it. However, as folks, many sort of, got drawn to the idea of collective impact and to the 5 conditions in thinking about a backbone organization, I think the reality is that most of society is not accustomed to non-hierarchical ways of working. And for many people in many communities and many leaders in the government, nonprofit, and private sector, there's assumption that someone needs to be in control, or else we're not doing our job. Someone needs to be running the show. And so I think some misperceptions, while people said, okay, great, another term that is often used for the backbone role is it's the quarterback, which, for those that follow football, American football, well, what do we call it in Canada? Because we have football in Canada, right? So that's what we call it, right?
We call it Canadian football.
Canadian football. Okay,
yeah.
Great. Well, so there's the idea of a quarterback, for those who know anything about football. And, I do think there needs to be this recognition that, what you see on this slide is that the backbone is never sort of driving things. They are not the self-appointed leaders. And yet it's a very different type of leadership. And so maybe switching to the next slide. So these are qualities that, we hear people associating with backbone leaders who we, are sort of effective in this work. It's a really unique and interesting role. I would say, it sort of combines sort of 2 twin capabilities that often aren't resident in the same individual. One is you need somebody who's very analytical and, is good at synthesis and gets and understands data and has a bit of a geekiness around themselves. They're a geek about data. But they also need to be people that, can be generative and understand co-creation. And so, they are neither sheep nor wolf. They're a schulf, somewhere, in between. It's a unique person that has both of these qualities. And, in addition to a number of the qualities that you see here. So, I think this is, the leadership that we're seeing associated with, effective backbone organizations. And, the evolution of this, I think, is that, that's one thing, is just sort of who does this. We're getting a clearer understanding of the type of person that leads well in backbones. I think it's always been the case it's been this type of person, but I think we're all doing this work, getting clearer at articulating what are the skills that are needed. So I think that's one evolution. It's really a change or, a clarification of perspective as much as anything there. But it's an important one, and I think increasingly, whether or not you're talking to funders or anybody who's involved in collective impact at a deep level, there's a lot more focus on this. And I think what another evolution is that, initially when we defined the 5 conditions, we talked about a backbone organization. And I think what we would suggest, and it's really from, observations from the field that, have led us to evolve our perspective, that it's not necessarily always one organization that plays all 6 roles that we looked at previously. That in some instances, particularly when resources are more scarce, that, it may be a number of organizations that split up those roles. And where does that make sense and where it doesn't make sense, that's totally context driven. So there's some basic principles, questions you can ask about that. But it is interesting when you're seeing multiple organizations play those roles. And then the last area I'll just address briefly is, sort of as we think about backbones and those that are sort of supporting organizations that are aligned around a bunch, an issue, we're seeing this sort of phenomenon of what I've termed in some venues as colliding collective impact efforts, where, as an example, we've worked in children's health initiatives, collective impact efforts, and also in cradle-to-career education efforts. And there's a clear overlap in terms of the issues when you think about, health being important to, children being able to pay attention in school, et cetera. And so I think we're finding this, sort of overlap, and that has clear implications for the backbone leaders of those efforts. So those would be a couple of sort of the evolutions of how we're thinking about those 6 roles. I don't think the 6 roles themselves have changed much, but I think some of the perspectives about, how they're being, the roles that are being played and sort of how the dynamics are playing out in communities, the field is giving good wisdom back to all of us on how to think about those roles at a deeper level.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that, John, and it's also context specific, which actually leads us into our next question, which is, and you raised that, are there different patterns that you're observing, whether in Canada, the United States, or even globally, from a backbone perspective? Are we seeing some differences?
Yeah, so I'm going to broaden the question a bit from what are the differences between, Canada, the U.S., and other places in backbones to maybe what are the differences, or are there differences in sort of how collective impact efforts are playing out, and then sort of what are the implications for backbones. And I've thought about this a bit. I want to, clarify that we have not directly consulted on collective impact efforts in Canada. But I've talked to you, Liz, and other practitioners in Canada, and I have had the opportunity to be in some communities in Canada speaking, and have had an opportunity to interact with people. So I have to base my observations purely on that, as opposed to a deep engagement with backbone organizations and collective impact efforts in Canada. But I think it is interesting. I mean, I've observed, if we talk about Canada versus the United States, I've observed some key differences that, in my mind, they're a matter of degree rather than fundamentally, oppositions between the United States and Canada. But I think they're kind of interesting to, sort of trying to spotlight on. I can think of 4 specifically, and this is, again, more related to collective impact overall, and then you can see how the implications play out for backbone organizations. The first is, my sense, and again, this is sort of reading the tea leaves. I don't have an empirical data set to share with you on this, but just my sense would be a couple of things. One is that the readiness and enthusiasm to work collectively seems to be higher in Canada. And I think this is, as I speculate as to why that would be, I think Americans, being one American, we're more drawn to the success of the individual. It's part of our historical and national narrative. The success of the iconoclast individual. That's what drives sort of the American U.S. narrative. And we recognize and hold up on a pedestal the awesome individual or organization. That's cover of our magazines. My sense is Canadians tend to want to believe more that the whole can deliver more than the sum of the parts, and are actually willing to act accordingly. And you said national health care is an example of that, and in terms of the differences between the U.S. and the United States in reception to that. So I think Canada seems to me to be a culture that's more comfortable with collective action. And again, this is all a matter of degree. I think the role of government, related to this notion of the, collective being important. The debate about the role of government is everywhere, Canada, the U.S., everywhere. But I think it's, while it has picked up in Canada, I still think it's less fierce in Canada than it is in the United States. For example, I think it's much more natural as we think about the role of backbones, it's much more natural in Canada to see a municipal or provincial government play a role as a backbone coordinating resource. It's not impossible that would happen in the U.S. We have some examples of having seen that, but it's much more in the U.S. the exception than the rule that government would play that role. So that would be a second difference. I think as we think about backbones, and particularly around funding the backbone, that there's the impact of philanthropy U.S. versus Canada is slightly different. And in the U.S., philanthropy typically has larger dollars and a larger voice in collaborative efforts than in Canada, at least as I've observed it, and I'm sure there are exceptions to that. But the fact that philanthropy is bigger and larger, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword in the U.S. On the positive side, in the U.S. where there's more philanthropy, theoretically there should be more flexible funds to support collective impact and to support backbones and to support shared measurement. On the flip side, I think because the United States has a fairly crowded funder landscape, particularly in major populated areas, it's less true in rural areas, but funders love to own their specific initiatives and pick and choose who they work with. And this is what drives the culture of isolated versus collective impact. I think this is more of a challenge to overcome in the United States than it is in Canada. So again, there's a little bit of a double-edged sword for backbone organizations in terms of the presence of philanthropy. And I think the last sort of, again, matter of degree that I might identify that I think has implications for backbones is that I think there's a greater appreciation among leaders and practitioners in Canada for the complex nuances of systems change. And again, this is all a matter of degree. And I think, there are some, in the United States, it's not that it doesn't exist, this sort of appreciation for systems thinking, but I think proportionally there's a higher percentage of thought leaders in Canada who are engaged in better understanding the nature of systems change and systems thinking specifically. And, I think, and again, this is reading the tea leaves, but as a result, I think there's a broader and deeper dialogue in Canada about understanding collective impact through the lens of systems thinking and complexity. And this, frankly, is one place where I think Canada is ahead of the United States. And again, it's not that many, people in the United States, and I'm sure many of the U.S. folks on the phone don't get it, but I think it's a smaller voice in the dialogue in terms of how to make progress against social problem, real systems thinking. And, we're looking to Canada, and we're looking to the United States, too. There's some great systems thinkers in the United States, but I'm learning a lot from folks in Canada around this. So those would be sort of differences I would point to.
And just quickly, John, because FSG does do this work in a global context, I would imagine that, we could go through every single country and say different things about it, but are there any patterns, even globally, that you have observed?
Well, I think, I think one of the, it would be really hard to do this work in non-democratic countries. And so I think to the degree that there's, a flourishing democracy, it makes it easier to do this collective collaborative work. In the absence of, a flourishing democracy, I think it's pretty hard because this is working across boundaries in a non-hierarchical way that requires trust and relationships. And so that, again, it's an opinion, it's an observation. Others might choose to disagree with it, but it would be an observation that I'd make.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, and I think it is, I think we do have to pay attention to context, right? Whether it's our local community context or our regional context or, state, province, country context. Those are all really critical elements of collective impact for sure. So our final question really is around the Champions for Change workshop that, 21% of our listeners are going to be attending in Calgary. How do you think that this will be, I think, that in Calgary it'll be our 6th time together, FSG and Tamarack hosting this workshop. How do you think participants who attend the workshop, how do they deepen their understanding of the backbone role and functions during the course of this workshop?
Yeah. So, I mean, I have to say, Liz, that, and Tamarack and FSG have collaborated on, as you said, I think this may be our 6th. And here's where, I really feel like we have learned so much from Tamarack, and it's been such a joy. I think Tamarack has a particular expertise in creating the conditions for deep learning to take place. And it's something where we really have, gone to school and learned a lot from you all. And it's a ton of fun. So I think, what I would say overall, if you look at the 3 days, it proceeds with an arc of, building, the understanding to deepening the understanding to then saying, okay, on day 3, how do we convert this to actual results? Because at the end, that's what we're all, interested in. And how do we take this back into our, respective communities? And so I think it's, and we are getting, we've done these a number of times, and I think every time it, evolves and gets better. But it's, I think the essence is it's about learning. It's about deep learning, and it's a collective learning experience, geared towards the way adults learn. And I think what's cool is there are a bunch of different sort of opportunities for learning, and again, it's something I think Tamarack does so well. We have faculty there, so you and me and Paul Bourne, your colleague, and other colleagues of mine from FSG, and Paul Schmitz, who joined the Collective Impact Forum, the former CEO of Public Allies, a very, important organization in the United States. And Paul, has retired after 20 years from that and is now part of the Collective Impact Forum and is there as part of the faculty. And then we have expert practitioners, so those who would never suggest that they have all the answers, but have been doing this work quite a bit and for a while, and learning from them is really, really great. And then, what's really cool is that you have your peers there who are experiencing these very same challenges. And we go back to the fact that the role of a backbone leader and the role of people that are doing this work, you're still fairly rare people. And it can be fairly lonely in your community. So to be able to come together and spend time with others and like, oh God, I'm experiencing that too. And it feels good if nothing else. But it's a good learning opportunity, I think. I think one of the things, again, that we've learned a lot from is just this notion of having learning labs, which is getting peers together, over the course of the 3 days and keep coming back to your peer group. A smaller peer group where you can reflect on what you're learning and process what you're learning. I have found to be just an amazing, just structure and way of creating deep learning. And so I think these are real fun events, and I think people have the most fun when they're learning. And so hopefully you get both.
Yeah, I think you're right about that, John. And I think what I have observed over the Champions for Change workshops that we've hosted together is also the breadth of diversity of topic areas that the collective impact efforts are focused on, and also population subgroups where we're seeing some of these collective impact issue areas or these collaboratives tackling some very challenging issues with some population subgroups that are more marginalized in our communities. And so to be able to, link people together, as you said, in these topic areas and across these subgroups, I think is a really helpful thing to do, and to do that during the course of a workshop like this is very helpful as well.
Yeah, and for those who aren't going to either DC next week or Calgary in April, Tamarack and FSG will, continue to do these. We're doing a couple a year, and so there will be more opportunities in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks, John. I think we've just given people, as they say in Canada, an hors d'oeuvre of the role of the backbone and the patterns of the backbone. I think you've raised some really interesting things for all of us to consider, particularly those of us that are working as part of the backbone infrastructure. Is how do we, communicate these roles in a powerful way, and really how do we say that this role, it should be valued and does require that that support and that infrastructure to help these efforts move forward, because they are about community change. Now I'm going to turn this over to my colleague Kirsty. I know that we invited you. This is something new for us at Tamarack, Kirsty. We invited some folks to send us, or we invited everyone to send us questions in advance, and we received a large number of questions. And I know, Kirsty, you've gone through the list and have identified a couple more to follow up with John on. So I'll turn it over to you for a couple of minutes.
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, thank you everyone for your questions. We do have quite a few, but we'll try and address more of the very popular questions. And John, the first one is really around how do you establish a backbone organization? And then there's the fact that the community selects the backbone. Is there a protocol or a template or prescribed path for how the establishment happens, or does it evolve organically with each initiative?
Yes. There are some, I think, some general principles, but it does evolve organically, and I think it's important to recognize that none of these efforts, like it's not an on-off switch; it's always a dimmer switch in terms of how these efforts get started. And so, typically, it is several individuals in the community that represent various different constituencies and are well regarded and considered even-handed, who, have the passion and sort of say, we think, taking a collective approach makes sense, and we're going to put our political capital and sweat equity into trying to make that happen. And they begin to mobilize people that represent different lenses into the issue. And in that process, there's always the challenge of, okay, well, if those are people who have day jobs, how do you support that? And so, it really always depends. Ideally, one of those folks is from a funder or has access to funders and can marshal some resources up front that can support. Often, the first step is the development of this common agenda, getting to align goals and a framework for change. And, often it may just be an ad hoc set of resources that are playing the role of the backbone in that initial stage. But, they still need to be funding. So sometimes it's a consultant or, people from the community, but they need some support. And typically that's the first role of the backbone in these efforts is, to help orchestrate bringing together a steering committee and to help orchestrate, the collective development of a common agenda. How that happens, which funder, is there funding, it's always very, very context-based. But in general, the principles are a couple of people that are perceived as even-handed, that see the issue and that are well regarded in the community and by their constituent communities, decide to get together and see if they can make something happen. And again, the degree to which they can get funding for a set of backbone resources to support that, it ends up being very context specific. Always better if you can.
So with that, there's a question here about whether or not you would classify the backbone's work almost as a life cycle where they move through stages of competencies or necessary skills that are required for each stage of where they're in their initiative and where the relationships are at. Would you say that there is sort of a life cycle approach to the backbone work?
Well, I think there is a life cycle to initiatives. You go from, it's the classic, what are the stage of sort of entrepreneurialism to, a more mature initiative. But I think the reality is we're talking, efforts that are 3, 5, 7, 10 years long. All the activities I talked about and we've written about are needed at every stage. Some of the challenges will be different. At the beginning, there's more of a need for orchestration, just to sort of, try to herd the cats and bring them together. Later on in an initiative, 3, 4 years in, there are challenges around things like sustaining the energy. People you can get people up front to get really excited about it for a year or two, but then how do you sustain it? And there are issues of sort of how do you allow and support as a backbone leader people transitioning into and out of roles in leadership, because it's really hard to expect that everybody Help Clients initiative is going to be there 5 to 7 years in. So there are going to be different challenges that you'll face that are life cycle based. But I would say all 6 of those activities that we mentioned earlier are relevant at all stages. There may be more or less when you're actually spending more of your time on some of those activities than others that are related to the life cycle.
So we did have quite a few questions actually about how to sustain the momentum and the membership and the engagement, and one related question is around collaboration fatigue. With so many collaborative meetings going on, different initiatives working together, could you suggest some ways that people can, how do they avoid burnout and maximize their efforts at the same time and keep people engaged?
Yeah, I mean, I think the more that there's a recognition that these problems and challenges that we face are not one-year issues. It's not quick fixes. You may get quick wins, but not quick fixes. We do need to shine a spotlight on this question of, how do we sustain energy? And energy is really the thing, that, where the focus is, or, perhaps should be. You can get a lot of people really catalyzed around, we talk a lot about you really shouldn't start a collective impact effort unless there's a sense of urgency in the community around a particular issue. It's hard to generate all the activity and coordination that's needed. People aren't going to change the way they do things unless there's a sense of urgency. Often you can get that burst of energy at the beginning, but you get 2 years in and people are like, oh, we haven't fixed the issue yet, and the people are on to the next thing. And so I think we all need to focus on that. I think what's interesting and ironic that the more I do this work and observe others who are effective at this work, that I think one of the keys, ironically, is trust and relationships. That this is work that you are going to go further, faster as you go deeper. And it is really hard to go deep at the outset. And if you keep the relationships at a superficial level, the next time you show up for a meeting and see, your peers across the room, you're like, oh, I know them, they're pretty nice, but I've got work to do. The more in these efforts you actually develop a fabric of deep and lasting relationships, the more it'll be easier to sustain energy because you'll get more out of it as individuals. Now, I think, the flip side of that is people are going to move, they're going to leave roles, and et cetera. But I think that's good. And I've observed that to be, if it's always the same people, you're probably doing something wrong. But I think where there's deep and lasting and trustful relationships that are very good at being authentic about being open and don't get sort of family dysfunctional about, well, if you're not part of the tribe, we're not letting you in, and they welcome in newcomers. If they welcome them in with the right energy, a newcomer is going to, and I've seen this happen, the right sort of people entering this in the midstream, when they see like, wow, there's this, fabric of trust and relationships developed, and I don't have to start from zero. I just have to jump on board and add what I'm adding, and as long as they're welcomed in, and truly, the trust builds that much more quickly for that individual, and that's what sustains energy. What sustains energy is the trust in the relationships, and we can't forget that. And a lot of times we think it's about, well, the next new, we need a new initiative. We need a new evidence-based practice. Those are important too. We always got to be bringing in new ideas, but what's going to sustain the energy is the deep trust and relationships.
Perfect.
One more question, Kirsty. We're starting to get close to 12 o'clock Eastern time. So one more question.
So this is a question probably both of you could comment on. It's about governance structures in collective impact work. And the question is around, are there more effective governance structures that you've observed or witnessed that you would recommend be inducted as for a backbone or a collective impact initiative?
So yeah, I'm going to answer it quickly because I want to give Liz an opportunity to answer the question, because I think Liz has done, actually, in Tamarack, have done deeper research on governance than we have. My shorter answer is I I think there are some basic principles here that are useful. I do think even governance ends up being very context specific. As a general principle, we don't believe that you should put huge bylaws and deep, rigid governance structures in place, because this is very fluid work. But creating clear expectations around roles and processes, that part of thinking through governance, I think, is really super important. But recognize that this is fluid work, and we have a bias towards not putting rigid structures in place. But
yeah,
Liz, I know you're deep on this.
Yeah, I would agree with you, John. I think that we view governance in collective impact work as being more horizontal than vertical. So sometimes we think about organizational structure as a hierarchy or vertical, and we actually see collective impact work as more horizontal. And I know both FSG and Tamarack have looked at the constellation model of governance and see some of its applicability to this collective impact work, right? This idea of having work groups that are they're energy filled, right? That they stay around when the energy is there, and that when the energy dissipates, that they're also allowed to dissipate as well. So there is some applicability there. I do think governance flows through all 5 conditions of collective impact and preconditions as well. If you think about influential champions, what's the type of leader that you want to bring, and then what does that mean from a governance perspective? If you think about, the common agenda, one of the things that you've identified in the common agenda is the values and principles, that drive this work. And I think that that's a kind of leadership/governance question. So governance is critical in terms of thinking through that role. But I agree with you, John. I think it is such a fluid way of working that minimum specifications, minimum rules are better than being overly prescriptive. And that's one of the workshops, tying it back to the Champions for Change. We're going to do a workshop on governance at the Champions for Change workshop. So we'll talk about it more there. I'm going to end here, Kirsty, and just do our final kind of closing. But before I get into the closing announcements, I want to just, again, thank John for sharing with us your wisdom and, the observations that FSG is making about backbones and their roles and functions and how they're structured in their governance, and also some of the patterns that you see emerging. I think that, it's fascinating to us at Tamarack as well, from the Canadian context, how we're seeing backbones emerge in Canada and some of those nuanced pieces as well. So thank you so much for your time and for your continued field building practice, not only you particularly, but FSG, and all of your team and all of your partners in terms of really building this field of practice of collective impact. I think it's one that has inspired lots of people and given us that, as you said, that shared language for work that, in many communities was already going on, but has really challenged us to kind of deepen both our experience but also the impact. And I think that this is the thing that for me is most exciting about collective impact, is looking at that impact that we are having on communities. So thanks so much for that, John.
Sure, Liz. Thanks. It's always fun. We've learned so much from you all at Tamarack, and we learn from everybody who's on the call. I think that's one of the exciting things about this movement. It truly is collective learning, and that's what's going to get us there. Is that if we can all get better, smarter, faster by learning from each other, and we learn a ton from everybody we interact in communities, and it's a really, really exciting movement. So thanks for asking me to spend this time with you.
Great, thanks. So for those of you on the call, you can see this slide that Tamarack has a number of learning events that we have coming up this spring and summer. We have our Champions for Change workshop that we've talked about already. We'll be hosting with our vibrant community partners and those of you engaged in poverty reduction work, a poverty reduction summit in Ottawa, Ontario, May 6th to 8th of this year. And then For those of you engaged in neighborhood revitalization and neighborhood connection work, we have our Neighbors Policies and Programs conference that we're hosting in June of 2015. And so you can learn more about these events by going to the link that you see on this slide. Just some final things to let you know. In a few days, we'll email you the links to the audio and other materials related to today's call. We'll also include a Storify. I saw that some folks were tweeting as we were going, so we'll include a link to that as well. We welcome your feedback on these calls, so please email Tamarack and let us know what you thought about today's call, and if you have any questions or if you have any topics for future webinars or future speakers that you'd like us to recruit onto the calls, we'd be happy to hear those suggestions and to try our best to enact them.